Okay, so I don't have anything to say at the start. I'll just point out that my position is that currently everything we know either has a naturalist explanation as of right now or could be explained by naturalism in the future. So I'll pass it to you so you can make your arguments.
All right. So in your first debate, I commented that there's actually quite a lot, and actually even the big questions of life that cannot be explained by the natural view, and I don't think ever will be explained, nor could they be explained by naturalism itself. I could quote Turek, who often points out that science doesn't actually, in fact, science doesn't explain anything at all. It's scientists that read the scientific data or they do their experiments, and through their own personal belief systems, often they interpret the data. And so science doesn't actually tell us anything. But I will say that Francis Bacon said, "It is true that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's mind about to religion. For while the mind of man looketh upon second causes scattered, it may sometimes rest in them and go no further. But when it beholdeth the chain of them, confederate and linked together, it must needs fly to providence and deity." And so I think what he's saying here is that when you look at just the universe by itself and you kind of get a surface view, then you could think in terms of naturalism. Carl Sagan said it's just there. Now let's look at it. So when you really go in depth in terms of things that science has no, even in terms of what you're saying, kind of using your verbiage, science really has no say in, and that is the cause of the universe. So it's virtually accepted that the universe has a cause. Scientists haven't figured out or even found an explanation for the cause itself. We know everything that has a cause has a causer or something. The first mover argument, I think, is a perfectly valid argument. So I don't know if we want to go into correct arguments but I'll just keep going. Let me finish up. So I think you've actually pointed out some of the problems in your arguments with the claim itself. So you say there are no correct arguments, which at least implies that you do believe in a universal truth, that there are universal, at least, facts. You believe in an ordered universe, and that is basically, it's capital from a theistic worldview, and I don't think it follows from any sort of atheistic naturalistic worldview. So I'll pass it over if you want to say which specific arguments you would like to go over. I've got 9 or 10 here we could hash out.
Okay. I don't know what your 10 arguments are, but I'll start off with you brought up for a little bit the first mover argument, I mean. And first of all, what I want to say is that while many people think the universe has a cause, we don't necessarily know that it has a beginning. For example, Stephen Hawking said that rather than the Big Bang coming from nothing, it's simply that we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, and it doesn't really matter. So what he says is there was never a Big Bang that produced something from nothing. It just seemed that way from mankind's point of perspective. So that's for the first mover argument. For the talking about universal truths, what I would say is whether universal truths exist doesn't really have anything to do with theism. If you want, you can argue that maybe we can only access universal truths if God exists, but the universal truths will exist independent of humans, whether or not God exists, and therefore that doesn't really support either side.
What's a universal truth cannot exist in an atheistic, unordered universe. For in an atheistic, naturalistic universe is pretty much by definition a lack of order. There's nothing to order it. You quoted Hawkins. Hawkins said that, well, he said philosophy is dead too. So he kind of wavered as in his last couple of years, he moved away from some of his original claims. He was more of an agnostic. And then before he died, he he went to what he described as a pure atheist. But he said, because gravity exists, the universe can create itself out of nothing, which is a completely incoherent statement. You're saying because something exists, nothing can create something out of nothing. Gravity is something. It's not nothing. So he's saying there are things that pre-exist existence, and that the universe itself pre-existed itself to create itself, which again is total nonsense. But that's what Hawkins said in his book. And John Lennox takes that on pretty heavily, pointing that out. So does Zacharias. I'll just pass it over.
Okay, so first of all, you said that under atheism there can be no order. First of all, I'll say that the natural laws of physics will create order as we see in the universe. Now, I mean, the word order is kind of vague, so maybe you think that galaxies existing isn't necessarily order. But what we do know is just because there's no order doesn't mean that there's no truth. For example, I can say that I exist whether or not the universe is ordered, whether or not I'm ordered. That's something that is true. So it doesn't matter whether the universe is ordered or not. So talking about Stephen Hawking says that gravity means the universe could have created itself. I agree with you that this probably doesn't mean that the universe did create itself. One of the issues with something from nothing argument is, again, like I said, we don't really know that nothing originally existed. That's the point of the quote I was citing from Stephen Hawking, is that it's not necessarily true that that there was like literally nothing and then the Big Bang happened. There were things that existed, just not in the way that we know it or abiding by the laws that we know. And therefore, it's possible that the universe could have been created from those things. And as such, there's no necessity for a God in order to create the universe.
Okay, so you said the laws of physics. So would you imply that the laws of physics just exist? Because I think if you go through this, there are things in this world that are outside of the natural world. So there's things like love. I'll get into the universal moral law argument, but I talked in the lounge just like a week or two ago, whenever it was, about the idea of infinity. Infinity is something that does not exist in the real world. I think you jumped in at the end on that one, or no, but I don't know if you caught that. But the idea of infinity is something that does not exist in the natural world, and it cannot exist in the natural world. And if you're going to say that the laws of physics and the laws of gravity are just there and they've always been there, that's not possible in the natural world, because again, you would have to infinity. So you would have to go back of time, which is not feasible. It's not possible. I would argue that from the three laws of thermodynamics, which says the universe is moving towards a steady state, we're running out of usable energy. So if you were to go back a period of time, you would get to the point to where the universe is perfectly usable energy, 100% usable energy, which you could say is the Big Bang, but still that's, I don't believe in the Big Bang. But what it does tell me is that if you were to go back a certain period of time, you would go to a beginning when everything began. And you couldn't go back infinite, you would have to go back to some starting point. And so I'd say that I think even your claims there imply there is at least a starting point.
Okay, so I'm gonna read you a few things that Stephen Hawking said. I'm gonna start off by talking about what you said about the fact that infinity doesn't exist, and I'm gonna dispute that. First of all, it's your burden of proof to establish that infinity can't exist in our universe. And since you haven't really provided any arguments to support that, we first assume that it's false, but also there's evidence that it's not true. So one thing that Stephen Hawking said is the boundary condition of the universe is that it has no boundary. And basically what this means is Time as we understand it literally did not exist before the universe started to expand. Rather, the arrow of time shrinks infinitely as the universe becomes smaller and smaller, never reaching a clear starting point. So it's not necessarily true that we can't have an infinite universe because time didn't exist the way we know it before the Big Bang occurred. So it could have existed infinitely beforehand. You also said gravity didn't always exist. I agree with you, but like I said, the laws of physics as we know it didn't really exist within the Big Bang. So we don't know how the Big Bang could have occurred from this starting position. But obviously, gravity isn't the only way it could have happened. There are multiple other ways that the universe could have been created that we don't understand. And therefore, we can't just say that, oh, the Big Bang couldn't have happened. And you say, again, this is the same. I have the same response for the laws of thermodynamics. So, everything's always tending towards entropy. The laws of physics didn't work the way that we understand them before the Big Bang. So we can't make claims like the laws of thermodynamics are always true. Therefore, a Big Bang couldn't have occurred. So there's still no necessity for a first cause outside the universe.
Okay, well, those are very unscientific claims. I mean, you're just assuming them. You don't actually know anything about what happened before the Big Bang or even the Big Bang itself. And so often theists are claimed to be the god of the gaps or something. We assume this or whatever. But here you have a really good example of the atheism that, and therefore. So, they used to have the oscillating. Carl Sagan used to say the universe is just there. Maybe there's parallel universes. None of this. There's no evidence of any of this. So why are they even proposing it? Let me disprove that, or I say prove that infinity does not exist in the real, actual world. You would agree that something that violates the law of non-contradiction should, well, what would you say? The law of non-contradiction. If it violates the law of non-contradiction, can it still exist? Is that a decent proof? You would say no. Which is larger, the set of natural numbers, or I should say, which is larger, the set of even integers or the set of integers?
They're the same size.
Okay, except that the set of even integers is half the size of the set of integers, correct?
No, they're the same size.
But, so right, they are the same size, and they are also not the same size. So the set of even integers has a set of even integers and the set of odd integers that when you combine is the set of integers. However, they are both infinitely large. So how can they be both, how can the set of even integers be both half the size of the set of integers and the same size at the same time? That's a violation of the law of non-contradiction, and therefore is, at least that's one, I think that would prove that infinity cannot exist in the real world, or at least would provide significant evidence to show that infinity cannot exist in the real world. I would also point out I told the joke, I won't go into it, but if I forget who it was. Somebody said that you could not transgress from point A to point B because you would have to go halfway, 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 and you would never actually reach your point. If you went halfway, you have an infinite amount of space between you and the point that you're going to reach. However, I can walk from here to the wall, and I could actually go through the wall if I really, really wanted to, right? So I can go to the wall. So we have these theoretical views that do not match up with the real world, the naturalistic world. And I think that's evidence to show, just one small piece of evidence to show that there are things outside of the natural world. So there is at least a non-physical existence. I would also argue universal moral laws, which you would abide by. I think no one can live in a world without universal moral laws consistently. People say they believe in it and they try to force themselves into that view, but they cannot live that way. Love, your parents probably say they love you, and I'm sure they do, right? And you probably say back, I love you, Mom. I tell my wife I love her. I'm not saying, well, chemicals in my brain made me feel funny. Don't worry, they'll pass. I'm saying there's actually something outside of the physical world that makes me feel this strong feeling towards you. So I think these are evidence that there are things outside of the natural world that show there is something that atheism cannot explain.
Okay, so I'm gonna go in order of what you said. So I'm gonna start off with the first claim you made is that atheists don't know what happened before the Big Bang, and they're just making stuff up. Like, we don't have any evidence for the multiverse theory or anything like that. And the issue with this is that I completely agree that we don't know what happened before the Big Bang, and potentially we have no way of knowing what happened before the Big Bang. But just because we don't know what happened doesn't mean that it's impossible for the Big Bang to be explained through atheism. This is a classic example of the argument from ignorance, which says basically it's we don't know, therefore God. We don't know how the Big Bang could have happened, therefore God must have done it. That's completely unfounded. He said that we don't know whether it's false, but just because we can't prove it doesn't mean that it's false. It's still a possibility. And since my opponent is the one making a truth claim saying that there must have been a God in order to cause the Big Bang, it's his burden to prove that there is no other possibility, not mine. Let's see. So next is the set of even integers thing. So mathematically, when you're talking about sets, two sets are of equal size if you can map one-to-one the elements of one set onto the elements of the other set. That's why the set of even integers and the set of all integers is the same side, because you can map 1, 2, 3, 4 to 2, 4, 6, 8. And the issue with this is he says that the set of all even integers has to be half as large, but he's just saying this without actually providing any evidence for this. Just because intuitively we think that it should be half the size doesn't mean that it actually is. So the same thing applies to Zeno's dichotomy. So the way this works is there's something called a supertask. You can look it up if you want, and it's basically a way that we can do an infinite task in a finite amount of time. And that is because every time I move a certain distance, it takes less time for me to move halfway, for example, than it does for me to move the full way. So when I go halfway, then a quarter of the way, then an eighth of the way, each step takes me less time, and therefore it's possible for me to complete the whole task in a finite amount of time. Just because we can't understand that doesn't mean it's impossible. Now, finally, on universal moral laws, you say that no one can live consistently, but the way this works is we don't know whether or not objective morality exists. But if objective morality does not exist, then it doesn't matter what we do. However, if it does exist, then we should act as if there were objective morality in order to fulfill our moral obligations. So it makes sense to act morally even if we're not sure, just because it doesn't matter if there was an objective morality, but we should act as if it was in case there actually is. Also, his claim that there's something outside the universe explaining love is unfounded.
Okay, so you said that I'm making the truth claim, but again, I pointed out that you said science has explained everything in the past, and what little that it has not explained. But the Big Bang is not something that can actually be explained. Nobody was there. They were just taking personal views and making propositions. So it's not something that can ever actually be explained because there's no way to actually see it. Science is, at least at one period in time, science was the study of repeatable experiments. You would make a hypothesis, you would then go study it, maybe repeat it, and then make conclusions. But the Big Bang is not something that can be, you can make a hypothesis, but you can't actually study it. So there's no way to study it. Second is that, again, the idea that these are the truth claims, again, you're the one that's making the actual truth claim. The thing of this is saying there are no correct arguments in support of God's existence, which itself says that there is an absolute truth. I mean, you're saying that the arguments in support of God's existence are wrong, so there must be a right. Well, what is right? What is correct? What is truth? What is fallacy? What is wrong? Those arguments themselves are evidence of something outside of the physical universe, reason, logic, things like that. Let's go to the two sets are equal if A is a subset of B and B is a subset of A. However, the set of even integers is a subset of the set of integers, but the set of integers is not a subset of the set of even integers because it contains twice as many elements. It contains the sets of even and odd. And so it has twice as many, but at the same time, they're both infinitely large. Therefore, it is a contradiction because they are not the same, yet they are the same. Or they're one, again, I'm saying one is if the set of even integers is size m, the set of integers is size 2m, but they are both infinitely large. How can you be twice the size of a set, yet the same size at the same time, in the same way? And that's really important. You yourself mentioned moral obligations. Where do you get the idea that anybody has any moral obligations? Where do morals come from? Where did these simply evolve? Did we find them? We'll get into that. We can get into that in the next little segment if you want.
Okay, so let's start with you say that I'm the one making a truth claim, and what I meant when I said that there's a naturalist explanation for everything is not that we know exactly how everything happened, but that everything that has currently occurred has a possibility of being explained without God. So that's not saying that we know the answer to all the questions about the Big Bang, for example. But just because we don't know doesn't mean that it's impossible. That's the claim I'm making, is that it's completely possible for a naturalistic worldview to explain the Big Bang. You're the one who's saying we don't know what happened. We can't explain what happened. Therefore, God must have done it. So it's your job to prove that it's impossible. I agree with you that we can't study the Big Bang. I don't think that's relevant to the claim I just made. You say that I'm making truth claims. So I'm saying that there are, for example, and that's a truth claim. First of all, I'm going to distinguish this from the Big Bang argument. Those are two separate arguments. But you say that logic and truth has to be outside of the universe, but you don't really provide any substantiation for why this is true. I agree that logic and truth are abstract concepts. Like I can't pick up something and say, hey, this is logic right here. But that doesn't mean that it's some supernatural force that we can't access somehow without God, and therefore it can obviously exist in an atheistic worldview because we create logic as humans, or logic exists regardless of whether we exist, but we don't need God in order to create those. Finally, on the topic of integers, so you brought up a good point. So you're saying one set contains the other, but not the other way around. And what I meant when I said that they were the same size is, I guess, that they have the same magnitude. So, for example, the number of rational numbers, the number of fractions, or sorry, not rational numbers, the number of irrational numbers, so all numbers that exist, is far greater than the number of integers. But because we can't map all the rational numbers onto all the integers, but we can map the integers onto each other. And just because, for example, it's not that they're twice as large. The way that sets work in a finite space is different than they work in an infinite space. So it's not a contradiction to say that one set is half as large as the other, because it's not. It's just that one set contains the other and the other does not. It's not a claim about size. And finally, so I talked about moral obligations, where they come from. I don't know where they come from, but that doesn't mean that we should act as if they don't exist, and therefore there's no contradiction in acting as if they do exist.
Well, again, if two are the same size and one contains the other, they must be the same set. However, they're not. So I'm just saying that this is evidence that the idea of infinity does not exist in the real world. It cannot exist in the real world. In fact, everything in the natural universe is finite. Can I count the grains of sand on the beach? Yes. Now, I don't have enough time to do it, but it can be done. Could I count the number of atoms in the universe? Yes. It is a finite number. Everything in the universe is finite. only things that exist inside the mind are infinite. Now, where do we come up with that idea? If they don't exist in the real world, because I think you would probably say the atheistic naturalistic view is that everything we know comes from what we observe, correct? Would you say yes or no? Just quick. Okay, so where do we get the idea of infinite? We cannot observe infinite in the natural world. Again, you can actually count the number of atoms, and it's been observed that it is something times 10 to the 50th or something like that. That's a 1 with 50 zeros. I don't remember the exact number. Doesn't matter. It is finite, though. However, okay. So, you said we create logic as humans. No, I completely reject that. And logic and reason are tools that simply exist. Now, from the theistic universe, we have a logical reason God of perfect logic, perfect reason. He's given us this perfect tool that we as humans are able to use. So I've several times gone into the woman on her way to Scotland. I won't go into it, a longer story. But if you believe that we are evolved, you have no reason to trust your reason or your logic. You have no reason to trust your senses. All you can do is say, I don't know. I think, maybe. I think, and therefore I think I am. But that doesn't even make sense in and of itself. So where do logic and reason come from? I said we get into moral laws, but we can get into that next. I'll kick it over.
All right, so start off with you say that we can't observe infinity. And I guess I misspoke when I said that we get all of our knowledge through observation. So we get some of our knowledge through observation. The other way that we can figure stuff out is through logic. Because, for example, neither of us are observing God, but both of us are making claims about whether or not he exists. And that's not through observation. So observation isn't the only way we can determine the truth of something. Now, you say that we can't, if under an atheistic worldview, because our logic evolved over time, we have no reason to trust it. First of all, I will say that it would make sense for our logic to be reliable, because if we couldn't reason accurately in order to understand the world as it exists, then we would probably die, because we wouldn't have any way to act in the world that makes sense. We would think there was a line in front of us when there actually wasn't, and that would mess us up. We would die. So evolution does explain our logic being reliable. Now, you could say I'm using my reason in order to justify my reason. And what I'll say here is I agree that it's impossible to know anything with absolute certainty, but that doesn't mean that we can't still investigate things and look for the most likely outcome. So, for example, I can't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, but I can deduce that it's very unlikely that I'm a brain in a vat, in the same way that I can deduce it's very unlikely that our reason is unreliable. There's no evidence to suggest that. It's just a claim that's being made. So while there's no absolute certainty, there is a very high degree of certainty, and therefore we can still use our reason in order to try to get to the truth.
So God by observation. Now, the theist believes that we can view God by observation. Now, we're not saying for an absolute 100% without doubt that we know him, that he exists. But we are, Frank Turek even says that we firmly believe and we will admit that there is a possibility that he doesn't exist. That's possible, right? You would have to agree there's a possibility that he does exist. So, but we would say that we do actually observe God's actions. So we don't see or talk to God directly, but there are ways that he makes himself known to the universe. One way is that he wrote a book, right? Through individuals, he penned a book. So I really think I really suggest you really dig into this idea of logic and reason, and that we would die without logic and reason. Where did logic and reason come from? Do animals have it? Animals exist, and they don't. I think we would say they don't have logic and reason. They can't go through this idea of sets. Any kind of logic and reason, really. They can do very, very basic. You hold out your hand, hey, I got a treat for you, and you put it in your hand. They can figure out, oh, I wonder if it's this one or that one. You run circles around the couch. They'll figure out eventually that I've been here before. So logic and reason, though, Again, these are things that exist outside the universe, and these are not things that could possibly have evolved. For if they did simply evolve, we have no reason to trust them. The thing is that, I'll tell the story. The woman's going to Scotland, never been there before. She's on a train. She looks out the window. There's a rock sculpture that says, "Welcome to Scotland." She has two things she can view that as. One is it's just an accident that the rocks evolved in that way. Therefore, she has no way to know if there's any kind of message being conveyed to her. Two, she can believe an intelligent being created that rock structure. And therefore, she can say, well, okay, then that there is a message being conveyed to me. I am entering Scotland, right? So logic and reason could not have evolved. They do not exist within the animal kingdom. And I really want to get to the moral argument, so I'll pass it over.
Okay, so you say that we can observe God's actions, and the issue with this is that we don't necessarily know that the actions were from God. For example, as an atheist, I would say that God did not cause individuals to write the Bible. Individuals wrote it themselves without God. So anything that you say, oh, this is an observable action from God, I will say, no, this is an observable action from something that exists in the universe that isn't God. And therefore, you can't say that we can observe God without first assuming that God exists. So it's circular logic. And this is the fundamental problem, is you say that there's no way that we can trust our logic without God. And what I said before applies now, which is that evolution would lead us to having correct logic, because if we can't understand the world, then we wouldn't be able to act in it. Why do our spaceships work? It's probably not because all our math is wrong and it just happened to work the way we wanted it to. It's probably because we used our logic and it ended up working. So we can say, okay, it's worked in the past. It makes sense that it would work. Therefore, we can trust it to a reasonable degree of certainty. And the issue is that the theist doesn't have any extra degree of certainty on top of the atheist, because like I said, neither of us can observe God's existence. And also, both of us are trying to use logic in order to come to the conclusion that either God exists or he doesn't exist. But the theist has to use logic as well. And saying that God endowed us with logic and therefore we can trust it, okay, that's assuming that God exists, right? Either of us can account for logic and logic being reliable, but saying that the theist has an extra degree of certainty is just wrong. And finally, I think was this argument about the person entering Scotland, was that like a fine-tuning argument or like intelligent design, or was that okay? Can you tell me what that was?
So that was just a basis for reason, that if reason evolved, we have no reason to trust it. So if we think that reason and logic just evolved, there's no reason that we believe we can use it. Now, I'll just really quickly say that I'm not saying the theist has much more evidence to believe in reason. I'm saying that the theistic worldview has a grounding that reason exists and is true, whereas the atheist just assumes, oh, it's just there, right? So, which makes no sense, especially from an atheistic worldview. You're borrowing capital from the theistic worldview.
I don't think you're making a presuppositionalist argument. So what I will say is you still haven't really addressed my point, which is that the atheist can't explain how our reason exists right now. Like I said, we can't know anything with absolute certainty, but that doesn't mean that our reason isn't reliable. That's the same argument I was talking about with, it would make sense that our reason is correct if it works. If when we try to build stuff, it actually works. The reason we have iPads is because we used our reason in order to create a structure that ends up functioning the way we wanted it to. And the fact that it does function the way we want it to implies that the reason we used in order to create that structure was valid, and therefore we can trust our reason to a significant degree of certainty. So I'll pass it to you to address that.
All right, so I've got a minute and a half left. So works does not mean make it true, right? Just because it works doesn't mean it's true. Now, I am saying that, yes, reason and logic exist in the world. Atheists and theists have equal access to it. Only the theist has a grounding in its existence that we can trust it. The atheist just assumes it's true and plays with it. So I think that's a very big logical fallacy in the atheistic worldview, is that they just assume it's there and they go and play with it. And the theist says, yeah, it's there. However, it doesn't work that way. So simply working doesn't mean it. So anyways, In my last 50 seconds, I'm just going to run through the arguments. So, number one, the beginning of the universe. So, pretty much accepted by all scientists. Not that we take the poll and say what's true, but the continuing existence of the universe. I'll post this later. This is Dr. Phil Fernandez. He gave a debate against several guys. But the design and order found in the universe, which you would agree with, that there is design and order. Even Richard Dawkins says there's design. It looks as if it's designed. The possibility of human knowledge, which I kind of went through. The reality of universal, unchanging truths. 2 times 2 is always 4. The existence of universal moral values. The absurdity of life without God. Just saying that you just die and become nothing. The respect for human life and the existence of evil. And thanks for taking the debate. And I am out of time. So maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Okay, so I'm guessing my turn will end after 3 minutes. So let's start out with, you say that just because our reason works doesn't mean it's true. And again, that's what I was saying, is we have a significant degree of certainty that it's true because it works. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, but it's probably true, and therefore we can use it in a way that's non-contradictory. You say that atheists don't have a grounding for the existence of logic. But I would argue that God did not create logic, because logic would exist regardless of whether God existed. The law of non-contradiction would exist with a God or without a God. So you can't say that atheists have no grounding for logic, because logic doesn't need a grounding. It's a truth that exists regardless of anything else in the universe. So I'll just go over quickly your recap of all the arguments. Again, first of all, the start of the universe, like I said, we don't know that the universe actually had a start. It's possible that the universe existed infinitely before, and therefore there was no need for anything to actually start the universe. And there's no reason that naturalism can't explain, under the different laws of physics that would exist before the Big Bang, a universe being created. And you said that infinity is impossible, but again, this isn't substantiated, so we can say that infinity is logical. And even if you say that like time couldn't exist before, like time couldn't have existed infinitely, time didn't exist the way that it exists now before the Big Bang. So we can't say that time would have existed infinitely before, but the universe could have existed before the Big Bang. So there's no necessity for a first cause. You say that there's order in the universe, which implies a designer, but again, it's completely unsubstantiated. There's no reason that just because, for example, that planets exist or life exists, that there has to be a designer. And you didn't really make any argument substantiating that. So finally, going on to the fact that we have truth. So this is the one we've been going over recently. And the point of this is, again, atheists do have a grounding in logic, just like theists do, which is that logic will exist independently of us. We don't need God to create logic for us. And there's no reason to believe that God is necessary in order for logic to exist. And finally, on objective morality, again, what I said before still holds, which you didn't really respond to, which is, if morality doesn't exist, then whatever we do doesn't matter. But if morality does exist, then we should act as it does. So as an atheist, I live as if morality exists, because assuming that it does exist, I should act morally. So even if we don't know whether morality exists, it still makes sense to act morally in the world. And there's no reason to believe that objective morality exists in the first place. So there's no reason for a God to be necessary in this case. And that's it. So